Hi, welcome to Developmental Ladder, an interview podcast designed to connect parents and caregivers to professors and scientists who study human development from infancy into adulthood. Today, we spoke with Dr. Erin Hambrick, an assistant professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Dr. Hambrick studies children who have been exposed to trauma. Specifically, her research includes identifying risk and protective factors following exposure to trauma, identifying helpful ways for caregivers to talk to children about disasters, and evaluating the effectiveness of available trauma treatments in community based settings. In this episode, we discuss trauma in infancy and how it affects development, the role of family systems in mitigating trauma, and the steps society can take to minimize trauma. Hello, Dr. Hambrick. Welcome to Developmental Ladder. I'm Mandar, a
Hi.
first year graduate student. Um, would you please tell us a little bit about your current academic position and how you came to it?
Yeah, sure. So right now I'm an assistant professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and I am a clinical child psychologist by training. So got my PhD in clinical child psychology and then went on to specialize in children exposed to trauma and early life adversities as part of my fellowship out at the Kemp Center at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. But because I did PhD work at KU, when it was time for me to look for a job, coming back to the Kansas City area sounded good. And I've definitely enjoyed um, being here in the Department of Psychology and especially our doctoral program, getting to train other students to become clinical psychologists.
So that is pretty awesome. I'm glad you came. You were enjoying Kansas City and you were able to come back to it. So moving on into more deeper into your research topics, would you please give us a brief overview of what exactly you look into?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just have a ton of interest within the field of child trauma. So, trauma psychology broadly. I'm very interested in how developmental experience kind of interacts with unique individuals to really result in a multitude of responses. No developmental experience is the same. So, no trauma is the same. Even if two people are exposed to the same tornado, their perception of what happened and even the specific objective things that happened to them are going to differ,
Hmm.
as are the ways that they respond. And I'm also extremely interested in how the timing of when someone experiences a trauma or adversity, how that relates to how the person does, right?
Okay.
In addition to the context in which the trauma occurs, particularly the relational context, which I know is kind of an interest of yours as well, right? But
Hmm.
when bad things happen very early in life, what are some protective factors, especially relational ones, that can really, in many cases, buffer the entire experience, right? Make it such that the developmental trajectory isn't really negatively affected, even though a potentially highly stressful thing happened to the child.
So then you look at different time points and how in like life milestones and how each trauma can affect at that time point essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and kind of taking a little more specific, I've been very interested in how events that happen very, very early in development
Hmm.
um, might have a bigger outcome on overall developmental trajectories than traumas or adversities that happen later in life, right? Because we
Hmm.
know that children develop so quickly when they're little, and that early experiences can be so formative, often because they're our first experiences. They're the template which we look back on and we say, oh, people are this way because the people I interacted with early in life were like this, right? But also, we know that the brain is very rapidly developing early in life, and so when bad things happen, when we're deprived of relationships early on, when our brain is constantly flooded with stress hormones very early on, there's a lot of research to suggest that that can be highly influential even over the lifespan, right? And
Yeah.
that's not to say there's no hope. for people who have negative early life experiences, but I think it's important to really try to understand the impact of those early experiences relative to the impact of similar experiences later, so that we can better plan what to do about it, right? How to think about prevention and how to think about intervention, in ways where we are putting our efforts and resources in the right places.
Yeah. Yeah, it is important to understand how traumas affect early on, because you're right, like kids develop so quickly, and the lower the age, the faster the rate of development, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, so
Yeah, and
then,
there's previously been, this prevailing idea, and I still hear people say it. Kids are resilient, kids bounce back. And what I kind of say to counter that is, um, children are really open to and affected by strongly by the experiences that they have, negative and positive, right?
right, yeah,
And we don't want to just assume that any response will be a resilience response, when
yeah,
actually the data are showing that in the absence of resilience promoting factors, early life trauma can have significant consequences.
okay. Then, speaking a little bit more about trauma, how can it be inflicted upon children, knowing or unknowingly? Like, what are
Yeah.
some factors behind it?
Yeah, I really love that question for a couple of reasons. Sometimes when I talk about early life trauma and people realize I'm talking about infants, they're like, infants can't be traumatized, right? Like,
Yeah.
when we think about trauma, we often think through the lens of our own lives. What might be traumatic to me,
Mm.
given my age? And infants are nonverbal. It isn't until about 8 to 10 months of age that infants have the capacity to start saying first words, right? And at that, it's so basic.
Yeah.
Um, and we have infantile amnesia. We don't carry forward very clear memories, declarative memories, that is,
Hmm.
of what
Yeah.
happens to us very early in life. So I think throughout the decades, there's kind of been an assumption that if it happens early on, it probably doesn't have a big impact, right? Because what happens to you when you're one, you can't go talk about when you're 15.
Yeah.
So the impact of early life trauma is a little different. And to your point, the things that are potentially traumatic for an infant are
Mhm.
also different. So the impact is typically seen through changes in physiology, which is why I was talking about brain development a little
Mhm.
earlier. And how the brain develops very rapidly, and it develops in response to our environment. So if our environment tells us, when I cry, people don't come, then maybe we stop crying altogether, stop
Yeah.
asking for help, or maybe we
Yeah.
ramp up the crying and say, okay, you know what? Every time I cry, I'm going to take it to a 10. I'm going to scream,
Yeah.
because a little bit of crying, that doesn't bring anybody, but screaming, maybe I'll get some form of interaction, right?
Mhm.
But all of that means typically that the stress response system is becoming sensitized, right? That the
Okay.
body
Yeah.
is learning, I have to be prepared to protect myself quickly and strongly, either in terms of trying to fight stressors, or in terms of really trying to weather them. And that's often
Yeah.
what we see with little infants is, infants are completely reliant on others. They
Mhm.
can't survive without
Yeah.
others. And so often what we see, when children experience trauma or adversities, and I'll kind of go into what some of those types are here in a minute, very early in life, is that their dissociative response system, their stress response system, that is really good at helping them internally weather the storm of not being taken care of, can be very easily sensitized, right? That they kind of rely on their body releasing endogenous opioids to make them feel good, even though they don't actually feel good, because nobody's holding them and rocking
Yeah.
them like they need, right? And so that kind of segues into, well, what can be traumatic for the young child, you know?
Yeah.
And when we come into the world, we parts of our brain physiology are developed. Our heart is beating, but other parts are partially developed. We really can't regulate temperature very well when we're quite young. Right.
Hmm.
And so, if we don't have someone regulating our temperature for us, holding us, making sure that we don't have too much clothing on, that we have enough clothing on, that can actually be a type of trauma to the young infant. Right. When we're
Yeah.
very, very young, right? When we're born, our stomach is like the size of a pea, right? Which means that it has to be filled repeatedly and on a predictable schedule.
Right.
And so, if there isn't a predictable schedule of feeding and receipt of food, that is a potential trauma to a young child.
Right.
Touch and getting the signal that we are part of a broader community and wanted, and that there is someone. Touch is very soothing to the stress response system. And the absence of touch can lead to things like failure to thrive, right? So even when you're getting enough food, if you aren't getting enough touch, your physiology might say, well, I'm getting this sustenance, but I don't know why it matters because I'm
Yeah.
not getting this touch, right? So lack of touch for 10 hours to an infant can be quite traumatic, whereas lack of touch to a 15-year-old for 10 hours could be
Yeah.
meaningless, right? Could
Yeah.
be meaningful, but also
Yeah.
could be meaningless, but
Yeah.
not meaningless at all, right? To an infant.
Yeah.
And also when we're an infant, we are very reliant on our sense organs to bring information to our brain to help us start to make sense of the world around us. Where am I? What should I expect? And so when we have sensory experiences that are harsh, that don't
Hmm.
make sense, and that are inconsistent, that can also be really stressful, right? So even though if there's yelling in your home, if you're a young infant, you don't understand what the yelling is about,
No.
but you do understand that there's been this harsh, inconsistent, jarring sensory environment.
Hmm.
And that has put you a little bit on edge, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, there are more overt traumas, right? So people have heard of things like shaken baby syndrome, right? Where
Yeah.
there's actually physical trauma to the child that I would say certainly corresponds with plenty of psychological distress. Um, but when we talk about what's traumatic to the infant, I'm like, it's really anything that keeps the infant from experiencing patterned, repetitive, soothing input from
Hmm.
caregivers at regular and expected intervals.
Right.
So babies don't need super parents to avoid trauma, but they need
Yeah.
that patterned, repetitive input that lets them know you're in a safe environment and you have the resources, the touch and the food resources that you need in order to just develop
Survive.
and let your
Yeah.
development unfold.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's very much in line with attachment literature as well, where
Yeah.
consistent parenting is important for secure development, which also has been insecure development. Attachment has led potentially leads to externalizing problems, internalizing symptoms. So yeah, it's very much online with how trauma works. And I
Yeah.
didn't
And,
think
and
about
even when we talk about kind of avoidant attachment, I'm not an
yeah.
attachment expert per se, but I think avoidance in general is very linked to that dissociative response, almost an
Mm,
element of it where it's like, okay,
yeah.
well, if you're not going to take care of me, I'll take care of me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I will
Yeah.
I will devalue the role of other relationships, because for me to value something that doesn't help me, doesn't come to my rescue, ooh, that's too
Yeah.
hard, right? I'm,
Yeah.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
find another way.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that totally adds up. And I'd never thought of infant trauma in that sense because it's easy to imagine physical trauma, but it is difficult to
Yeah.
understand psychological. Even though I do know that infants are very susceptible to environmental changes. Yeah.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And so, when you think about, all right, well, from these early months of life, the brain starts piecing together what's safe, what can I expect from the world. And when you think about that as an iterative process from here, then these neural connections wire together. And
Hmm.
then, the infant can even start to change how they respond and react to people,
Yep. Yeah.
such that
Yeah.
if you take an infant that's had severe neglect and place them in the most loving home you can find when that infant is 4 and 5 months old, that infant is likely to be described by the caregivers that they're placed with as difficult to soothe,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
As right, like, and so those caregivers will need a lot of preparation to really not be turned off by the
Yeah.
behaviors of the infant, right? To really stick it out and to really allow that infant to
Rehab.
form new understandings of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So then, speaking of families, what role do family systems play in increasing or decreasing just trauma and early life stressors for children and infants,
Yeah.
um, just in general?
Yeah. It's another great question because primary caregivers play a huge role in
Yeah.
terms of not only protecting kids from stressors, making sure that people who are in the home are safe, making sure that there's plenty of supervision and attention to the infant. They play a huge role. And I will say maybe they play the most direct role.
Hmm.
But what we can't ignore is this broader question of families and social support outside of the people playing the direct role. Because if there is not support in place at a broader level, then the people who are supposed to play or who have wanted to play or could play that more direct role,
Yeah.
right, sometimes people don't plan pregnancies, right, and things like that, but um, when that's not in place, it is so hard for the people who are trying to play the direct role to do their job, right? So when I think about the fact that, for example, in the US, we don't just flat out have paid leave for new parents, and not even for one caregiver,
Yeah.
let alone both caregivers who
Yeah.
are highly needed. It's just crazy to me, right? Because we know that infants need round the clock care, and quite frankly they need it for way longer than the 12 weeks that many people would just be excited and beside themselves to actually have 12 weeks of paid leave. And that's only a drop in the bucket in terms of the amount of time that infants need that round the clock care. So again, it's not super parents that we're looking for. It's not super caregivers. And I use the term caregiver intentionally because there are lots of grandparents raising grandchildren, right?
Yeah.
There are lots of homes where there are two people who identify as men who are the primary caregivers, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of diversity in terms of caregiving that I want to respect. A lot of the conversation just automatically goes to moms because,
Moms. Yeah.
right, biological females are able to,
Yeah.
get pregnant and give birth. But I think, we need to be very inclusive when we talk about this, especially because, okay, let's say that 85% of kind of the most primary caregivers are moms. Maybe they've decided to breastfeed, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
But their work with that child has to be facilitated by the other people in their sphere, right? The other people who are available. And so we need people in the environment who are able to support someone taking time off of work to care for the infant, right? We need employers to actually see the value in letting their employee have time off now so that they can set their family on a positive trajectory and re-enter the workforce stronger, right? Perhaps even more committed. We need providers who people go see when they've just had an infant to be aware of how demanding it is so they can be asking the right questions, right? How are you doing? What resources do you need access to? Are you available or are you aware of these home visiting programs, right, that are available that could come into the home?
Hmm.
Um, so I think so often we focus on kind of the mother-child bond,
Yeah.
and yes, it can be directly important, but if we are ignoring the community-based factors, the policy factors, all of these other things that feed into how successful that primary caregiver can be, then we're ultimately not protecting infants from trauma.
Right.
Most neglect that happens in the first year of life is neglect that I would say caregivers did not want to happen to their child, right?
Mhm.
It's neglect that
Yeah.
occurs because people had to continue working, because people couldn't afford childcare, because
Yeah.
formula is crazy expensive. And as much as
Yeah.
people want to say that breastfeeding is free, no, it's not. You have to eat a ton of food to be able to do work like that,
Yeah.
right? And there's
Yeah.
all the tools that come along with it. So, um, you know, it's a lot of work just to get kids kind of the basic protective factors that let's say there is domestic violence within the home. Well, a kid's going to be a lot better off if the mom or the dad, or whoever it was that was the receiver of that violence, is able to get out of that situation or otherwise protect the child.
Yeah. Yeah. So speaking of different, parental availability, do you
Yeah.
know, since Europe has implemented some laws where parents are allowed to stay home longer, both parents, if that is an option, is
Mhm.
there a relationship that you have observed or the literature has observed where that has led to some lower trauma or just early life stressors in general for kids?
Um, you know, I hesitate to be too like, oh yes, exactly this.
Mm-hmm.
But there are data to suggest that
Okay.
kids who have access, or parents who are able to stay home, that there are less stressors within the home.
Mm-hmm.
And then relate that to the literature that we know about family stress when there are infants in the home, right? And it's not a lot of leaps to see that we need to do that. And so there are a lot of uh, policy implications, I think, in terms of ensuring that we can be there for the very, very young kids. Yeah.
Okay. So then what are some current like we are very far behind in supporting the pay of family models and helping children, like helping family models sustain a life of child. What are some public policy efforts being taken today to reduce or help uh, parental systems?
Yeah. Well, besides people really advocating for
Mm.
parental leave, or, leave for primary caregivers,
Yeah.
um, there are also advocates for better access to, funding for women, infant, and children funds, right?
Mm.
So we know that having federal and state funding available to families who have young children, we know, and I can't think of the exact research off the top of my head because it's not the research I do myself, but we know that dollars spent lead to more dollars gained early in life. And so while it's not very popular to spend money preventively, right? So we're going to make sure that this family has no problem paying for formula for their young child, right? So they
Yeah.
can set off on the developmental trajectory. Longitudinal studies have definitely shown that when there is funding available for all children to have the nutritious food that they need, and to have access to appropriate resources early in life,
Mm.
that not only do you see better developmental effects, but you see a return on investment later. And
Yeah,
again,
that
that's not always popular, because
yeah.
later is 10, 15 years later,
Yeah.
long after those dollars were allocated,
Yeah.
right? But longitudinal research is certainly painting the picture that we need to be doing that, and we need to be focusing far more dollars on these first 2 months, first year of life. Goodness, even when someone finds out that they're pregnant,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
that they can be getting appropriate prenatal care, because we do see the return on investment later.
Yeah, that totally makes sense because if parental systems are absent, then there are more problems, psychological problems, which need care in general. Like if you're looking at a direct path that need to be taken care of later, which is more resources being spent, which could have just spent on earlier, and then these wouldn't be an issue. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and beyond, what are we doing from a policy perspective? Because that kind of gets into politics.
Mm.
Just efforts that people are trying to implement, right? What do we do? What do we do when we know that early life trauma matters and it might have an even bigger impact than later life trauma.
Yeah.
What do we do about that? Well, we need to disseminate things like home visiting programs that have been shown to lead to better outcomes. And, David Olds' home visiting program, Dr. Olds developed it, 20, maybe 30 years ago. And so has been studying the outcomes of it for that long. And
Hmm.
he's even found that mortality rates in the moms who received services when they were expecting infants, and then when they had infants in the home and they were receiving support from nurses. So the program was
Hmm.
called Nurse Family Partnership. And they
Okay.
were just receiving information like, how do kids develop? What promotes children's development? How do I
Yeah.
decrease all the stress that happens? It's stressful to have a baby in the home. The nurses, I think, just became another relational figure that supported and, provided that just that psychological resource for the moms. They're even noting that the mothers themselves live longer. So not just are the kids doing better, but the moms are leading healthier lives and longer lives.
Yeah. That is very interesting.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
really cool.
Yeah. So, to sum it all up, what is your take home message beyond the fact that early life stressors need to be reduced as much as
Mhm,
possible?
mhm. I think my message is um, we are not we're going to win the battle but lose the war if we just kind of focus on trauma as it comes up or becomes apparent, right? We have to be looking at what are some of the underlying reasons why trauma is so prevalent, and what are some of the underlying reasons why mental health problems are so prevalent and perhaps arguably increasingly prevalent. Rates of child abuse and neglect are actually decreasing, but rates of things like the incidence of disaster traumas are increasing. And, poverty, right, is still with us, and discrimination based on age, gender, race, ethnicity, right?
Yeah.
It's there and it's strong. And if we don't think of ways to start protecting children, embedding them within healthy communities early, we aren't going to win the war, right? And
Yeah.
the American Academy of Pediatrics recently put out a paper
Hmm.
on what are we going to do? How are we going to win against adverse childhood experiences? They're prevalent. By the time people are 16, they've typically experienced one, if not two.
Yeah.
The kids I work with who are in therapeutic preschools and usually enter around the age of 3 or 4, they on average have experienced eight potentially traumatic experiences by
Yeah.
age 3, right? Those
Yeah.
really formative years.
Yeah.
And so the American Academy of Pediatrics came out and said the way that we're going to do this is by promoting relational health and stability. And so when I talk to people, I even kind of ask them to look beyond the trauma and look toward what can we feasibly do, right? Because
Yeah.
kind of like how poverty is always with us, unfortunately, our susceptibility, our likelihood of experiencing a trauma is also always with us. So, how do we build healthy communities? How do we support people in having the relationship access that they need across all aspects of their lives, right? Not just with their mom, but with another caregiver in the home, with extended family, with teachers and caregivers outside of the home. And how do we focus on making those relationships enduring instead of ones that just kind of rotate and change, right? Because it's not really that we just need relationships. We need consistent, predictable, enduring relationships that can truly help us weather hard times. And so it's not as easy as just saying, oh, let's hook a kid up with a mentor for a month or two, right? It's got to be much more systematic than
All right. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Hambrick. I really
that.
appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for being interested in the topic.